The Mother's Intuition. Chapter 1. Perfect on paper. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as Eleanor Whitmore adjusted the silverware for the third time. Everything had to be perfect. Her son James was bringing Camille home for Sunday dinner. Again. And this time, Eleanor sensed something different in his voice when he'd called. There was a tremor of excitement, a barely contained energy that suggested tonight might be the night he'd announce their engagement. At 62, Eleanor had learned to trust her instincts. 35 years of marriage to a diplomat had taught her to read people like sheet music. Every pause, every inflection, every carefully chosen word told a story. And lately, the story surrounding Camille Dubois had been playing a discordant melody in Eleanor's mind. The doorbell's Westminster chimes echoed through the Georgian manor, and Eleanor smoothed her navy blue before walking to the foyer. Through the beveled glass, she could see James's tall silhouette beside a petite figure in cream-colored wool. Her heart did that familiar flutter it had done since he was 5 years old, equal parts love and protective worry. "Mother!" James swept her into a bear hug that lifted her slightly off her feet, his blue eyes sparkling with joy. "You look radiant as always." "James, you flatter me." Eleanor laughed, but her gaze had already moved to the young woman beside him. Camille Dubois stood with perfect posture, her honey blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, designer handbag clutched with manicured fingers. Everything about her whispered expensive taste and careful cultivation. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Camille's voice carried just a trace of a French accent, like vanilla and expensive perfume, present but not overwhelming. "Thank you so much for having me again. Your home is absolutely magnificent." She extended her hand, and Eleanor noticed the way Camille's green eyes swept appraisingly over the antique console table, the Monet sketch hanging in the hallway, the Persian runner beneath their feet. It was quick, professional almost, the way an appraiser might catalog valuable items. "Please, call me Eleanor." Come in, come in. Dinner will be ready shortly." They settled in the living room, James immediately gravitating toward his usual spot on the leather Chesterfield sofa. Camille perched beside him with the grace of someone trained in deportment, her ankles crossed, hands folded in her lap. Eleanor poured wine from a bottle James had brought, a Bordeaux that probably cost more than some people's monthly grocery budget. "So, Camille," Eleanor began, settling in her chair with her own glass. "James tells me you've been working at the French Cultural Center downtown." "Oh yes, it's wonderful work. I help coordinate cultural exchanges, language programs, things like that. It keeps me connected to my heritage. Sometimes I miss France terribly." James reached over and squeezed her hand. "Well, you won't have to miss it much longer. I've been thinking we should plan a trip there soon. Maybe you could show me Lyon, where you grew up." Something flickered across Camille's face. So quickly, Eleanor almost missed it. Fear? Panic? But then the smile was back, brighter than ever. "Oh, darling, Lyon is, well, it's changed so much since I left. I'm not sure you'd find it very interesting." Eleanor filed that away. In her experience, people who truly loved their hometown rarely spoke of it with such dismissal. "I spent several years in Lyon, actually, back in the early 80s when Richard was stationed at the consulate there. Beautiful city. The old town is like stepping back in time." Camille's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. "Oh, how lovely. Yes, the old town is very historic. Have you been back recently? I imagine your family must miss you." "My parents passed away several years ago," Camille said softly, and James immediately wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "It's part of why I came to America. Too many memories, you know?" Eleanor felt a familiar pang of maternal sympathy, but something about the way Camille delivered the line felt rehearsed, too smooth, too practiced. The conversation flowed through dinner. Talk of James's architectural firm, Camille's work at the cultural center, plans for the upcoming holidays. Camille was charming, asking thoughtful questions about Eleanor's volunteer work at the museum, complimenting the food, sharing amusing anecdotes about cultural misunderstandings she'd witnessed at work. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching a performance. Every response seemed carefully calibrated, every laugh perfectly timed. It was like watching a masterpiece painting from across a room, beautiful and impressive, but somehow lacking the warmth and imperfection of real life. After dinner, as Eleanor served coffee and her famous apple tarte tatin in the sitting room, James cleared his throat nervously. "Mother, Camille and I have something we wanted to tell you." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Oh?" James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Camille gasped and pressed her hands to her chest in apparent surprise. Though Eleanor noticed, she didn't look particularly shocked. "Camille Dubois," James said, dropping to one knee right there on the Aubusson carpet. "Will you marry me?" The ring was stunning. A vintage Art Deco setting with a 2-carat emerald-cut diamond that caught the lamplight like trapped fire. Eleanor recognized it immediately. It had been her mother-in-law's engagement ring, passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore women. "Oh, James! Yes, of course." Camille's voice broke with emotion as she extended her trembling hand. The ring slid on perfectly, which struck Eleanor as odd, since James hadn't had the opportunity to find her ring size. They embraced, and Eleanor forced herself to smile and clap. "Congratulations, darlings. This calls for champagne." As she went to retrieve the bottle of Dom Perignon she kept for special occasions, Eleanor's mind raced. Something felt off about the entire proposal, but she couldn't put her finger on what. Maybe it was the way Camille had seemed to expect it, or how she'd known exactly how to position her hand for James to slip on the ring. Maybe it was the fact that they'd been dating for only 8 months, and James had never been one to rush into anything. Or maybe, Eleanor thought as she popped the cork, it was simply a mother's natural resistance to sharing her son with another woman. God knows she'd been accused of that before. They toasted with champagne and cake, and Eleanor did her best to play the role of delighted future mother-in-law. Camille seemed to glow with happiness, her laughter more genuine now, her touch more frequent as she reached for James's hand or straightened his collar. "We were thinking about a spring wedding," James said, his arm around Camille's waist. "Something elegant but not too large. Camille doesn't have much family here, so it would mostly be our friends and relatives." "How sad that your family can't be here," Eleanor said to Camille. "No aunts or uncles? Cousins?" "There are a few distant relatives scattered around Europe, but we've lost touch over the years. When my parents died, those connections, well, they faded away." Eleanor nodded sympathetically, but made another mental note. In her experience with French culture, family connections were taken very seriously. The idea of distant relatives simply fading away struck her as unusual. As the evening wound down, James and Camille prepared to leave. They stood in the foyer saying their goodbyes when Camille's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "Excuse me, I need to take this quickly," she said, stepping toward the powder room for privacy. Eleanor could hear her voice through the door, speaking rapid French. Her tone was sharp, agitated, completely different from the gentle, cultured woman who'd been sitting at their dinner table. "What are you doing? I told you not to call me here." Eleanor froze. After 4 years living in France, her French was more than passable. She moved closer to the powder room door, pretending to straighten a photograph on the hallway wall. "Écoute-moi bien. Cette vieille vache ne soupçonne rien. Elle est tellement naïve." "Listen to me carefully. This old cow suspects nothing. She's so naive." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Old cow. Camille was talking about her. "Le fils est complètement sous mon charme. Le mariage aura lieu au printemps. Et après ça, je récupérerai ma part de l'héritage et la carte verte. Ensuite, je disparaîtrai, comme les autres fois. The son is completely under my spell. The wedding will happen in the spring, and after that, I'll get my share of the inheritance and the green card. Then I'll disappear like the other times." Eleanor gripped the photo frame so tightly that her knuckles went white. Other times. This had happened before. "Tu me connais, Michel.
J'ai étudié cette famille pendant des mois. Elle a de l'argent, beaucoup d'argent, et le fils unique hérite de tout. You know me, Michelle. I studied this family for months. She has money, lots of money, and the only son inherits everything. The conversation continued for another minute, Camille's voice growing more confident, more cruel. She laughed at something the person on the other end said, a sound like breaking glass compared to the musical laughter she'd shared at dinner. When the powder room door opened, Eleanor had managed to compose herself and was standing casually by the coat closet. Camille emerged, her mask of gentle beauty firmly back in place. Sorry about that, she said to James with an apologetic smile. Wrong number, but they were very persistent. No problem, love. He helped her with her coat, pressing a kiss to her temple. Ready to go? Eleanor hugged them both goodbye, forcing herself to embrace Camille with the same warmth she'd shown all evening. The young woman's perfume was expensive, Chanel No. 5, and her skin was soft as silk. She was everything a mother might want for her son, at least on the surface. Thank you for a lovely evening, Eleanor. I'm so excited to be part of the family. Welcome to the family, dear. Eleanor managed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She watched from the window as James's BMW disappeared down the tree-lined drive, its taillights fading into red pinpricks in the darkness. Then she walked back to the sitting room, poured herself another glass of wine, and sat in her late husband's favorite chair. Eleanor Whitmore had survived diplomatic crises, foreign coups, and social scandals that would have destroyed lesser women. She had buried a husband, raised a son as a single mother, and built her reputation in their small Connecticut town as someone you could count on in a crisis. But she had never faced anything like this. Her son was engaged to a con artist, a woman who had studied their family like a mark, who saw James as nothing more than a path to money and citizenship, who called his mother an old cow while accepting her hospitality and wearing her family's ring. Eleanor finished her wine and began to plan. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay in her king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction she'd had with Camille over the past 8 months. The pieces that hadn't quite fit before now formed a disturbing pattern. The way Camille had always steered conversations away from her past, the vague answers about her work that never quite provided specifics, the perfect clothes and accessories that seemed expensive for someone working at a cultural center, the gaps in her knowledge about Lyon that Eleanor had initially attributed to homesickness, but now seemed more like ignorance. At 5 a.m., Eleanor gave up on sleep and made her way to Richard's old study. The room hadn't changed much since his death 3 years ago. His desk still held his fountain pens and leather blotter. His books on international relations and European history lined the walls. His reading glasses sat in their case by his favorite lamp. But Eleanor had made one addition, a state-of-the-art computer system. At 62, she'd been determined not to become one of those elderly people left behind by technology. She'd taken classes, practiced, and now she was more than capable of conducting the kind of research this situation required. She started with basic searches. Camille Dubois, French Cultural Center, Lyon, France. The results were frustratingly generic. The Cultural Center's website listed her as a program coordinator, but provided no background information. Social media searches turned up a Facebook profile that had been created only 10 months ago, around the time she would have started dating James. The photographs on Camille's Facebook were telling in what they didn't show. No childhood pictures, no family photos, no friends from France, just glamorous shots of Camille in various locations around New York and Connecticut, always alone or with James. It was as if her life had begun the moment she'd arrived in America. Eleanor made herself coffee and a light breakfast, then settled in for a long day of investigation. Her years as a diplomat's wife had taught her patience and thoroughness. If Camille Dubois was a fraud, there would be evidence. By noon, she had found the first crack in the facade. The phone number listed for the French Cultural Center connected her to a friendly receptionist named Maria, who was happy to chat about the organization's programs and staff. "Oh, Camille is wonderful," Maria gushed. "Such a dedicated worker. Although it's funny, she's only been with us for about 9 months, but she talks about the programs like she's been here for years. 9 months? Eleanor kept her voice casual. I thought she'd been there longer. No, she started in February. Actually, it was kind of unusual how she was hired. Usually we have a long interview process, but she came with such strong recommendations from, what was the name of that organization in France? Some cultural exchange program. The director was so impressed with her references that he hired her almost immediately. Eleanor made careful notes. February was exactly when James had started mentioning a new woman he was seeing. I don't suppose you remember the name of the French organization? Asked Eleanor. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't, but I could ask Mr. Henderson if you'd like. He's our director. That's quite all right. I was just curious. Camille mentioned it once and I couldn't remember. After she hung up, Eleanor stared at her notes. 9 months at the Cultural Center. Started dating James around the same time. References from an unnamed French organization that had impressed the director enough to bypass normal hiring procedures. It was starting to look very much like someone had created a perfect backstory. Eleanor's next call was to her friend Patricia Morrison, who worked in the State Department's Visa Services Division. They'd known each other for decades, since their husbands had served together in Brussels. Patricia, darling, I need a favor, Eleanor said, after they'd exchanged pleasantries. Of course, Eleanor. What do you need? I'm trying to help with some paperwork for my future daughter-in-law. She's French, here on what I believe is a work visa. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about the process for someone in her situation to obtain permanent residency. Well, that depends on several factors. What kind of work visa does she have? Eleanor realized she didn't actually know. I'm not sure of the specifics. But hypothetically, if she were to marry an American citizen, then it becomes much simpler. Marriage to a U.S. citizen is one of the fastest paths to permanent residency, and eventually citizenship. The spouse can file for adjustment of status, and if everything is in order, she could have her green card within a year or so of the marriage. Eleanor felt sick. And after that? Patricia's voice grew cautious. Eleanor, is everything all right? This sounds like more than just general curiosity. I'm sorry, Patricia. I suppose I'm just being an overprotective mother. You know how it is when your child gets engaged. You start worrying about everything. I understand completely. To answer your question, if the marriage ends before the 3-year mark, it can complicate the citizenship process, but she would likely still keep her permanent residency status as long as the marriage was entered into in good faith initially. After ending the call, Eleanor sat back in Richard's leather chair and processed what she'd learned. Camille was positioned to gain enormously from marriage to James, not just financially, but legally. And even if the marriage ended, she would still have achieved her primary goal of permanent residency. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. James's voice was bright with excitement. Mother, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but Camille and I wanted to invite you to lunch next week. We're starting to look at venues for the wedding, and we'd love your input. Eleanor's heart ached at the joy in her son's voice. That sounds wonderful, darling. I can't believe how lucky I am, Mom. Camille is she's everything I've ever wanted in a partner. Smart, beautiful, kind, and she loves me for who I am, not for the family money or connections. Do you know how rare that is? Eleanor closed her eyes. If only he knew how wrong he was. Yes, James, very rare, indeed. I know you were a little reserved with her at first, but I can tell you're warming up to her. It means the world to me that you two are getting along. She's certainly made quite an impression, Eleanor said carefully. After James hung up, Eleanor returned to her computer with renewed determination. If Camille Dubois was a professional con artist, as the phone conversation had suggested, there would be other victims, other broken hearts and emptied bank accounts. She started with social media again, but this time she searched more broadly. Instead of looking for Camille Dubois, she saved photographs from Camille's Facebook profile and used reverse image searching to see if the same photos appeared elsewhere online under different names. It was tedious work, but Eleanor had patience born of desperation. She was fighting for her son's life, his happiness, his future. She would search every database, follow every lead, leave no stone unturned. At 4 p.m., she hit pay dirt. One of Camille's photos, a professional headshot that appeared on her Facebook profile, also appeared on a website called Elite European Companions. The name associated with the photo wasn't Camille Dubois. It was Camille Laurent. Eleanor's hands trembled as she clicked through the website. It was clearly some kind of high-end escort service, though the language was carefully coded. Cultural companions for discerning gentlemen, sophisticated European women for social occasions, discretion guaranteed. Camille's profile, under the name Laurent, described her as a refined French companion with extensive cultural knowledge and social graces. The description mentioned her fluency in multiple languages and her ability to blend seamlessly into any social situation. Eleanor felt nauseated. The woman who was engaged to her son, who wore her family ring, who had sat at her dinner table and accepted her hospitality, was advertising herself as an escort. But the name discrepancy gave Eleanor a new search term. She tried Camille Laurent in combination with various terms: France, Lyon, arrests, fraud. What she found made her blood run cold. A small news article from a French newspaper, dated 2 years earlier, told the story of a confidence scheme that had bilked several wealthy Parisians out of thousands of euros. The scam involved a young woman who targeted older, lonely men through social clubs and charity events. She would cultivate relationships with them, gain their trust, and then disappear with jewelry, cash, or forged checks. The woman's name was Camille Laurent. The accompanying photograph, though slightly different due to a change in hair color and style, was unmistakably the same person now engaged to Eleanor's son.
According to the article, Camille Laurent had fled France before police could arrest her and was believed to have assumed a new identity somewhere in Europe or North America. Eleanor printed out the article and sat staring at it for a long time. Here was the evidence she'd been looking for. Proof that the woman planning to marry James was a wanted criminal, a professional con artist who had already destroyed lives in France. But she also knew that simply presenting this information to James wouldn't be enough. He was deeply in love, possibly to the point where his judgment was compromised. He would demand more proof, would want to hear Camille's side of the story. And Camille was clearly skilled at manipulation. She would have explanations, tears, protestations of innocence. Eleanor needed more than a 2-year-old newspaper article. She needed current evidence of Camille's deception, something so clear and undeniable that even James would be forced to see the truth. She thought about the phone conversation she'd overheard the night before. Camille had been talking to someone named Michel, someone who was clearly involved in whatever scheme she was running. If Eleanor could record a similar conversation or gather evidence of Camille's ongoing criminal activity, the idea that formed in Eleanor's mind was dangerous and possibly illegal. But as she looked at the photograph of the woman who planned to destroy her son's life, Eleanor knew she would do whatever it took to protect James, even if it meant becoming a criminal herself. Chapter 3. Playing the Game. Eleanor spent the next week preparing her strategy with the methodical precision that had served her well during Richard's most challenging diplomatic postings. She had learned long ago that the best intelligence operations were built on patience, observation, and the ability to appear harmless while gathering devastating information. Her first priority was establishing surveillance without arousing suspicion. She hired a private investigator, a retired federal agent named Marcus Webb, whom she'd known socially for years. But she didn't tell him everything. She simply said she had concerns about her future daughter-in-law and wanted to verify some details about her background. Just the basics, she told Webb over coffee at a discreet cafe in Hartford. Employment history, previous addresses, financial records. Nothing invasive, just what any careful mother might want to know. Webb, a silver-haired man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, nodded understandingly. "I've done this kind of thing before, Mrs. Whitmore. Usually it's fathers checking out their daughters' boyfriends.
but maternal instincts are just as valid. I'll be discreet. While Webb began his official investigation, Eleanor started her own covert operation. She called James and suggested that she and Camille spend some time together, just the two of them. I feel like I haven't really gotten to know her, Eleanor said, which is true, if not in the way James would interpret it. Perhaps we could have lunch, do some shopping. I'd love to help her feel more at home here. James was delighted. Mom, that's exactly what I was hoping for. Camille mentioned that she sometimes feels a bit lonely here, not having family around. It would mean the world to both of us if you two could become close. They arranged to meet at Le Bernardin, an upscale French restaurant in Manhattan. Eleanor arrived early and positioned herself at a corner table where she could observe the entire dining room. She had a small digital recording device in her purse, not admissible in court, perhaps, but potentially useful for convincing James of the truth. Camille arrived exactly on time, looking stunning in a black wool dress and pearl necklace. She kissed Eleanor on both cheeks in the French manner and settled into her seat with graceful efficiency. Eleanor, thank you so much for suggesting this. It's wonderful to spend time together, just us ladies. My pleasure, dear. I thought it would be nice to get to know each other better before the wedding planning gets too hectic. They ordered wine, a Sancerre that Camille selected with expert knowledge, and began with light conversation about the restaurant, the city, the unusually mild November weather. Eleanor was studying Camille carefully, looking for cracks in the facade, inconsistencies in her story. This wine reminds me of a little bistro in Lyon where my parents used to take me. On Sundays after church, we would walk through the old town and stop at this place. Oh, what was it called? Café something. Eleanor nodded sympathetically. Lyon has so many lovely bistros. Do you remember which arrondissement it was in? Camille's smile flickered slightly. Oh, you know Lyon? A bit. As I mentioned, Richard and I lived there for several years. We had an apartment in the 6th, near Parc de la Tête d'Or. Yes, the park. Beautiful place. Camille's response was generic, the kind of thing anyone might say about any park, anywhere. Eleanor decided to test further. We used to love the puppet shows there. Guignol, you know? Did you go to those as a child? Oh, yes, of course. Very traditional. But Eleanor could see the uncertainty in Camille's eyes. The Guignol puppet shows were actually associated with Lyon's other famous park, not the Parc de la Tête d'Or. A local would never confuse the two. As lunch progressed, Eleanor became more confident in her assessment. Camille's knowledge of Lyon was superficial at best, the kind of information someone might glean from a guidebook or website, but not the deep familiarity of someone who had grown up there. You know, James mentioned that you studied literature at the University of Lyon. I have a friend who taught there for many years, Professor Martel in the French department. You might have had classes with him. This was a complete fabrication. Eleanor knew such no person. But Camille didn't hesitate. Oh, yes, Professor Martel. Wonderful teacher. Very inspiring lectures. Eleanor made a mental note. Camille was willing to lie about academic credentials she could not possibly verify on the spot.
After lunch, they strolled through a nearby boutique district. Camille had exquisite taste, gravitating toward the most expensive items with unerring accuracy. When she tried on a cashmere scarf that cost $800, Eleanor noticed how naturally she handled luxury goods, not with the careful reverence of someone unaccustomed to such things, but with the casual familiarity of someone who had worn expensive clothes before. It's beautiful, Eleanor said, but perhaps a bit costly for someone working at a cultural center? Camille laughed, a sound like silver bells. Oh, I have some savings from France. My parents left me a small inheritance. Another lie, Eleanor was certain. Everything about Camille suggested someone who was currently well-funded, not someone carefully stretching inherited savings. As they walked back toward the restaurant to collect Eleanor's car, Camille's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and her expression changed subtly. A tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of her posture. Excusez-moi, she said to Eleanor.
then answered the phone in rapid French, stepping slightly away for privacy. But Eleanor had positioned herself carefully, and her French was more than adequate for eavesdropping. Quoi? Maintenant? Je suis avec la belle-mère. What? Now? I'm with the mother-in-law. Eleanor pretended to study a shop window while listening intently. D'accord, mais sois discret. Elle n'est pas aussi stupide que je pensais. All right, but be discreet. She's not as stupid as I thought. Eleanor's heart pounded. Did Camille suspect something? The conversation continued for another minute, with Camille agreeing to meet someone later that evening at a location Eleanor couldn't quite catch. When Camille rejoined her, her mask of pleasant congeniality was firmly back in place. Sorry about that. Business call, very boring. They said goodbye with warm embraces and promises to get together again soon. Eleanor drove home with her mind racing. The investigation was progressing, but she sensed that time was running out. Camille was becoming suspicious, and Eleanor couldn't afford to tip her hand before she had enough evidence to convince James. That evening, she called Marcus Webb for an update on his official investigation. I've got some preliminary information, and Mrs. Whitmore, I have to say your instincts were right to be concerned. Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. What did you find? Well, for starters, the employment verification is shaky. The French Cultural Center confirms she works there, but when I tried to verify her references from France, the organization they listed doesn't seem to exist, at least not under the name they provided. What about financial records? That's where it gets interesting. Camille Dubois has only existed in the U.S. financial system for about 10 months. No credit history before that, no previous addresses, no tax records. It's like she materialized out of thin air. Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction. What about her apartment? She's renting a studio in Manhattan under a month-to-month lease, pays cash, no co-signers, no references. The landlord told me she paid 6 months up front when she moved in. 6 months up front in cash? Eleanor's mind raced. That must have been thousands of dollars. Exactly. Not the kind of money most people have lying around, especially someone who supposedly just immigrated and started a new job. Eleanor thanked Weg and asked him to keep digging, particularly into any records under the name Camille Laurent. She didn't mention the escort website or the French newspaper article. Not yet. She wanted to see what Webb could uncover independently. After hanging up, Eleanor sat in Richard's study and reviewed everything she knew. The evidence was mounting, but it was all circumstantial. She needed something more concrete, something that would prove beyond doubt that Camille was a criminal and a fraud. She thought about the phone call Camille had received during their shopping trip, a meeting that evening somewhere in the city. If Eleanor could observe that meeting, recorded perhaps, she might finally get the proof she needed. The idea was dangerous. Eleanor was 62 years old, not a trained investigator or spy, but she had advantages too. She was invisible to most people, just another well-dressed older woman in an expensive car. She could follow, observe, and disappear without arousing suspicion. More importantly, she was running out of time. James had mentioned that he and Camille were planning to apply for their marriage license next week. Once they were married, Camille's legal position would become much stronger, and the financial damage could be catastrophic. Eleanor made her decision. That evening, she would follow Camille Dubois and see exactly what kind of business she was really conducting. For the first time since overhearing that devastating phone conversation, Eleanor felt like she was taking control of the situation. Whatever happened next, she would be ready. Chapter 4. The Trap is Set. Eleanor had never conducted surveillance before, but she approached it with the same methodical planning she'd once used to organize state dinners for visiting dignitaries. She dressed in dark, nondescript clothing and drove her older Mercedes, less conspicuous than the newer BMW, to Manhattan. Finding Camille wasn't difficult. Her apartment building was a converted warehouse in Tribeca, the kind of trendy building that attracted young professionals with more money than sense. Eleanor positioned herself across the street at a cafe where she could observe the entrance while appearing to read the evening paper. At 7:30 p.m., Camille emerged wearing a long black coat and high heels, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked stunning and dangerous, like a film noir heroine stepping into the night. Eleanor watched her hail a taxi, then quickly got into her own car to follow.
The taxi headed uptown, weaving through traffic with Eleanor maintaining a careful distance behind. They ended up in Midtown, stopping at a sleek hotel bar that catered to business travelers and expense account entertainment. Eleanor parked and waited 15 minutes before entering the hotel. The bar was dimly lit and sophisticated, with leather banquettes and soft jazz playing in the background. She spotted Camille immediately, sitting at a corner table with a man in an expensive suit. Eleanor positioned herself at the bar where she could observe them in the mirror behind the bottles. She ordered a glass of wine and pretended to check messages on her phone while watching the interaction at the corner table. The man was perhaps 50, silver-haired and well-groomed, with the soft look of someone who spent his days in boardrooms rather than gyms. He was clearly wealthy. His watch was a Rolex, his suit custom-tailored, his manner confident in the way that only came with serious money. Eleanor couldn't hear their conversation over the music and ambient noise, but their body language told a story. Camille was animated, leaning forward, occasionally touching the man's hand or arm. He was captivated, hanging on her every word, his eyes never leaving her face. After an hour, they left together, the man's hand possessively on Camille's back as they walked toward the elevator bank. Eleanor felt sick. Was she watching her future daughter-in-law conduct some kind of affair? Or was this something more sinister? She waited in the lobby, pretending to read magazines, until Camille reappeared 2 hours later, alone. Her hair was slightly mussed, her lipstick gone, but she looked satisfied in a way that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Eleanor followed Camille's taxi back downtown, then drove home with her mind churning. What she had witnessed could have been an innocent business meeting, or an affair, or something else entirely. Without audio recording or more concrete evidence, she couldn't prove anything. But it confirmed her growing certainty that Camille Dubois was not who she claimed to be. The next morning, Eleanor called Marcus Webb with a renewed urgency. "I need you to accelerate the investigation, and I want you to look into something specific. Can you find out if Camille has been using dating websites or escort services?" Webb was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you sure you want to go down this path? Sometimes what we find isn't what we want to know." "Mr. Webb, I'm sure of very little right now, except that my son is in danger. Please, just find out what you can." While Webb worked his official channels, Eleanor decided to take a more direct approach. She had an idea, risky, but potentially decisive. If Camille was running some kind of con involving wealthy men, Eleanor could present herself as a target and see what happened. She created a fake identity, using skills learned from years of watching Richard navigate diplomatic deceptions. Eleanor became Elizabeth Hartford, a recently widowed woman with substantial assets and a lonely heart. She crafted a profile on several high-end dating websites, complete with carefully edited photos that showed her jewelry and expensive clothing without revealing her face clearly. The backstory was simple but compelling. A widow whose late husband had left her well provided for, but who was struggling with loneliness and looking for companionship. Someone, in other words, who would be attractive to a con artist. Within 48 hours, she had responses from several men, but also something unexpected. A message from what appeared to be a consultation service for discerning individuals seeking cultural companionship. The message was professionally written and carefully worded, offering to introduce her to sophisticated European women who specialize in providing cultural companionship for social events, travel, and personal enrichment. The language was deliberately ambiguous, but Eleanor recognized it as the same type of coded communication she had seen on the escort website where she'd found Camille's photo.
Eleanor responded, indicating interest, and provided the phone number of a burner cell she'd purchased specifically for this operation. Within hours, she received a call from a man with a slight accent, possibly French, possibly something else. "Mrs. Hartford, this is Michelle. I understand you're interested in our cultural companionship services." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Michelle, the same name from the phone conversation she had overheard at her house. "Yes, I'm new to this sort of thing, but I have some social events coming up, and I thought it might be nice to have someone to accompany me." "Of course, I understand completely. We have several exceptional young women who would be perfect for your needs. May I ask, are you looking for someone for just one evening or a more ongoing arrangement?" "Oh, ongoing, I think. I have quite a busy social calendar, and—" Eleanor let her voice trail off suggestively. "Excellent. Now, our fees vary depending on the specific services required, but for the level of companionship you're describing, we typically ask for a retainer of $5,000 with additional fees for each engagement." Eleanor nearly choked. $5,000? And that was just the starting fee? "That seems reasonable," she managed. "Do you have someone in mind?" "Actually, I have the perfect young woman for you. Camille is one of our most sophisticated companions. French, highly educated, extremely cultured. She has experience with clients in your demographic." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. "Camille sounds lovely. When could I meet her?" "Let me check her schedule. She could meet you tomorrow evening for a consultation. There's a wine bar in Tribeca, Celsius, very discreet. Shall we say 7 o'clock? Eleanor agreed and hung up, her hands shaking. She had done it. She had connected Michelle to Camille, and now she had a meeting arranged where she could gather concrete evidence of the criminal enterprise her future daughter-in-law was running. That evening, she called James to cancel their planned dinner, claiming a sudden headache. She needed time to prepare for what might be the most important performance of her life.
The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor chose her outfit carefully, expensive but not flashy, the kind of clothing that whispered money rather than shouted it. She practiced her cover story until she could deliver it naturally, and she tested the small recording device she'd hidden in her purse. By 6:30 p.m., she was positioned at Celsius, a sophisticated wine bar with dim lighting and intimate seating areas. She chose a table near the back where conversations could be conducted privately, and ordered a glass of the most expensive wine on the menu. At exactly 7 o'clock, Camille walked in. Eleanor's breath caught. Seeing her future daughter-in-law in this context, dressed provocatively, scanning the room with predatory calculation, was jarring beyond words. This wasn't the sweet, cultured young woman who had sat at Eleanor's dinner table. This was someone else entirely. Camille approached her table with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "Mrs. Hartford, I'm Camille. Michelle said you were interested in our services." Eleanor forced herself to smile warmly. "Please, call me Elizabeth. And yes, I'm very interested. Please, sit down." As Camille settled into her chair, Eleanor activated the recording device in her purse with a subtle movement. Whatever happened next, she would have evidence. "Michelle mentioned that you're looking for ongoing companionship," Camille said, her voice professional but warm. "Why don't you tell me a bit about what you have in mind?" Eleanor launched into her prepared story about being recently widowed, lonely, and overwhelmed by social obligations. Camille listened with perfect attention, occasionally asking probing questions about Eleanor's financial situation, her living arrangements, her family connections. "I don't have children," Eleanor lied smoothly, "so it's just me now. The house feels so empty, and all these social events. Well, it would be nice to have someone to accompany me, someone cultured who understands proper etiquette." "I understand completely," Camille said, leaning forward with practiced sympathy. "Loneliness can be devastating, especially for someone of your refinement. You deserve to have companionship that matches your social level." They discussed practical arrangements, how often Eleanor might need companionship, what types of events she attended, her preferences for conversation and social interaction. Throughout it all,
Camille was gradually extracting information about Eleanor's wealth and vulnerability. Our standard arrangement for ongoing companionship is quite comprehensive. For a monthly retainer of $15,000, I would be available for up to 8 social engagements per month, plus private dinners or cultural events as needed. Eleanor nearly gasped. $15,000 a month? Nearly $200,000 a year? That seems substantial, she said carefully. Camille's smile didn't waver. Elizabeth, you're not just paying for my time. You're paying for discretion, sophistication, and complete dedication to making your life more fulfilling. Many of our clients find that the emotional support is worth far more than the monetary investment. As they talked, Eleanor began to understand the true scope of Camille's operation. This wasn't just escort service. It was a sophisticated emotional manipulation designed to extract maximum money from wealthy, vulnerable clients. And judging by Camille's confidence and polished presentation, she had done this many times before. I'd love to think about it, Eleanor said finally. This is all new to me, and I want to be sure I'm making the right decision. Of course, said Camille, reaching into her purse for a business card. Take all the time you need, but don't wait too long. I only accept a limited number of clients, and my schedule fills up quickly. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor took a calculated risk. You remind me of someone. Do you ever go by any other names? Camille Laurent, perhaps? For just a split second, Camille's mask slipped. Eleanor saw recognition flash in her eyes, followed by careful wariness. I'm sorry, I don't know anyone by that name. Perhaps I just have one of those faces. But Eleanor had seen enough. The recognition in Camille's eyes confirmed that she was indeed the same person from the French newspaper article, the wanted con artist who had fled Europe. They parted with warm goodbyes and promises to speak soon. Eleanor drove home with the recording device burning like a coal in her purse. She had done it. She had concrete evidence of Camille's criminal activity, her willingness to defraud vulnerable clients, and her connection to the identity Camille Laurent. But as she pulled into her driveway, Eleanor realized her work was far from over. Having evidence was one thing. Convincing James to believe it was another. And she was running out of time. According to James's last phone call, he and Camille were planning to get their marriage license the next week. After that, stopping the wedding would become infinitely more complicated. Eleanor had one more card to play, the most dangerous one of all. She was going to force Camille into a corner and make her reveal her true nature in a way that even James couldn't ignore. But first, she needed to call Marcus Webb and see what his official investigation had uncovered. Between his findings and her recorded evidence, they might finally have enough to destroy Camille's carefully constructed facade. As Eleanor walked into her house, she felt a grim satisfaction. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Chapter 5. The Webb Titans. Marcus Webb's call came at 7 a.m. the next morning, waking Eleanor from her first sound sleep in weeks. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to see you immediately. What I've found, it's bigger than we thought. They met at a diner 40 minutes outside of town, the kind of place where truckers and early commuters grabbed coffee and eggs before starting their day. Webb looked haggard, as if he'd been up all night researching. I've been tracking the name Camille Laurent, like you suggested. Mrs. Whitmore, your future daughter-in-law is wanted by Interpol. Eleanor's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Interpol? She's not just a small-time con artist. This is organized crime. The operation spans multiple countries: France, Belgium, Switzerland, now the United States. She works with a network of accomplices who help her identify targets, create false identities, and launder money. Webb opened the folder, revealing printed emails, financial records, and surveillance photographs. Eleanor saw Camille's face staring back at her from what looked like police files.
The pattern is always the same, Webb continued. She targets wealthy, older individuals, sometimes men, sometimes women, occasionally entire families. She creates elaborate backstories, gains their trust over months or years, then either disappears with their money or, in more sophisticated cases, marries into the family and drains their assets slowly. Eleanor studied the photographs. In some, Camille looked exactly as she did now. In others, her hair was different colors, her style altered, but it was unmistakably the same person. How much money are we talking about? Eleanor asked. Millions. In France alone, she suspected of stealing over 2 million euros from various victims. One family in Belgium lost their entire estate, a chateau that had been in their family for 300 years. Eleanor felt sick. What about accomplices? At least 3 that we know of. There's Michel Rousseau. He handles the technical aspects, creating false documents and identities. There's a woman named Sophie Moreau, who sometimes poses as character references or family members. And there's someone they call Le Docteur. We think he might be the mastermind behind the whole operation. Webb split another document across the table. But here's the really disturbing part. In 2 cases, the victims died under suspicious circumstances shortly after large financial transfers. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Died? Both were older men who had recently changed their wills to include their new fiancée. One supposedly fell downstairs, the other had a heart attack. In both cases, the local police found the deaths suspicious but couldn't prove foul play. Eleanor stared at the papers, her mind reeling. She had thought she was dealing with a gold digger, a con artist looking for easy money. But this was something far more sinister. There's more, Webb said grimly. I managed to trace some of her financial activity here in the US. She's been receiving wire transfers from offshore accounts, significant amounts, way more than she could be making at the cultural center. How much? In the past 6 months, approximately $200,000, all funneled through a complex network designed to obscure the money trail. Eleanor sat back in the vinyl booth, overwhelmed. The scope of Camille's criminal enterprise was staggering, and James was walking directly into the center of it, completely unaware of the danger. What do we do? She asked. Webb closed the folder. Normally, I'd say take this to the FBI immediately. But here's the problem. Most of this evidence was obtained through methods that wouldn't hold up in court. The French authorities have been trying to build a case against this network for years, but the suspects are too smart, too careful. So they're untouchable? Not necessarily. But we need to be strategic. If we approach this wrong, Camille will disappear like smoke, and your son might disappear with her. These people don't leave loose ends. Eleanor thought about the recording in her purse, the evidence of Camille's ongoing criminal activity in New York. Combined with Webb's information, they might have enough to convince James, if they approached it correctly. I have additional evidence, she said. Then told Webb about her undercover meeting with Camille. His expression grew more grim as she described the escort operation and the monthly fees Camille was charging. Mrs. Whittemore, what you did was incredibly dangerous. If they suspect you're investigating them, they already suspect something. Camille mentioned that I wasn't as stupid as she thought. But I don't think she knows how much I've discovered. Webb rubbed his temples. We need to move fast, but we also need to be smart about this. James won't believe any of this unless we present it perfectly. And even then, people in love have an amazing capacity for denial. Eleanor nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. James was intelligent, but he was also emotionally invested in Camille. He would fight any evidence that threatened his happiness. I have an idea, she said slowly. But it's risky. She outlined her plan. Instead of confronting James directly, they would set a trap for Camille. Eleanor would arrange another meeting, this time with the FBI secretly recording everything. They would get Camille to incriminate herself so thoroughly that even James couldn't deny the evidence. Webb looked skeptical. The FBI won't set up an elaborate sting operation based on what we have. Not yet. We need more than recordings of escort activities. We need evidence of the bigger crimes. Eleanor had anticipated this. Then we force her hand. We make her think I am a threat, that I know too much. If she's as dangerous as you suggest, she'll reveal her true nature. Mrs. Whittemore, if you're right about these people being killers, then my son is already in mortal danger, isn't he? At least this way we control the situation. They spent the next hour refining the plan. Webb would coordinate with law enforcement, sharing what he could without revealing Eleanor's undercover activities.
Meanwhile, Eleanor would arrange one final meeting with Camille. This time, not as a potential client, but as James's mother, who knew too much. As they prepared to leave the diner, Webb grabbed Eleanor's arm. "Are you absolutely sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. And if I'm right about how dangerous these people are," Eleanor thought about James, about his excitement over the wedding, about the way he looked at Camille with such complete trust and love. She thought about the other victims Webb had described, the families destroyed, the suspicious deaths. "Mr. Webb, 3 days from now, my son is getting his marriage license. After that, Camille will have legal access to everything. His money, his property, his life. If we don't stop this now, we may never get another chance." Webb nodded grimly. "Then let's end this." As Eleanor drove home, she realized she was crossing a line she had never imagined crossing. She was about to engage in a dangerous game with professional criminals, putting herself at risk to save her son. But she also knew she had no choice. She was a mother, and protecting her child was an imperative that overrode every other consideration. That evening, she sat in Richard's study and composed the most important message of her life, a text to Camille that would either save James or put Eleanor herself in mortal danger. "Camille, this is Eleanor. We need to talk about your real identity and what you're really doing to my son. I know about Camille Laurent, the escort service, and the money transfers. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the Westchester Country Club. Come alone, or I go to the police with everything I know." She stared at the message for 10 minutes before hitting send. Then she poured herself a large glass of wine and began preparing for what might be the most dangerous afternoon.
Outside, the November wind rattled the windows like skeleton fingers, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover just how far a mother would go to protect her child. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. Eleanor arrived at the Westchester Country Club 30 minutes early, choosing a corner table in the main dining room where their conversation would be public enough to discourage violence, but private enough for candid discussion. She had informed Marcus Webb of the meeting, and he was positioned in the parking lot with a clear view of the entrance. The country club had been Eleanor's social sanctuary for 20 years, a place of tennis matches and charity luncheons, book clubs and bridge tournaments. The idea of conducting a confrontation with a wanted criminal in these familiar surroundings felt surreal, like staging a gunfight in a cathedral. At exactly 2 p.m., Camille walked in. Eleanor barely recognized her. Gone was the sweet, demure fiancée who had charmed James and accepted Eleanor's hospitality. This woman moved with predatory confidence, her designer coat and perfectly styled hair unable to mask the cold calculation in her eyes. Camille slid into the chair across from Eleanor, without greeting or preamble. "You've been busy, Eleanor. Not as busy as you have, apparently. Camille Laurent, or should I call you by one of your other names?" A slow smile spread across Camille's face, and for the first time, Eleanor saw her without any mask at all. It was terrifying. "You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for. I underestimated you. That was my mistake. Your mistake was thinking you could destroy my son and walk away unscathed." Camille laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Destroy him? Eleanor, you have no idea what you're talking about. James will be very happy with me, for as long as it lasts." The casual cruelty in her tone made Eleanor's stomach turn. "How long is that, Camille? How long before you disappear with his money? Or is this one of the cases where the groom meets with an unfortunate accident?" Something flickered in Camille's eyes, surprised perhaps that Eleanor knew so much. "You've really been thorough in your investigation. Thorough enough to know that you're wanted by Interpol. Thorough enough to know about Michelle and Sophie and your friend, Le Docteur. Thorough enough to know about the dead men in France and Belgium." Camille was quiet for a long moment, studying Eleanor with new respect. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this information?" "That depends on you. You're going to break up with James. Today. You're going to tell him you've realized you're not ready for marriage, that you need to return to France to take care of family business.
Something believable that won't make him suspicious. And if I refuse, Eleanor reached into her purse and placed a USB drive on the table between them. This contains recordings of our meeting the other night, financial records showing your wire transfers, and copies of the Interpol files. If you don't end this engagement voluntarily, I'll give it to the FBI and let them sort it out. Camille stared at the USB drive for several seconds. When she looked up, her expression had changed again. Less predatory now, more calculating. You know, Eleanor, you're quite impressive. I can see where James gets his intelligence. In another life, we might have been friends. In another life, you might not have been a sociopathic criminal. Sociopathic? Camille tilted her head thoughtfully. I prefer to think of myself as practical. The world is full of lonely, wealthy people who need someone to make them feel special. I provide a service. You steal their money and sometimes kill them? I take what they're willing to give. As for the deaths, Camille shrugged elegantly. Sometimes old men have heart attacks. Sometimes they fall downstairs. These things happen. Eleanor felt cold dread creeping up her spine. Camille was admitting to murder with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. James is young and healthy. I had planned for our marriage to last several years, long enough to gain access to the family trust, establish myself legally, perhaps have a child to cement my position. But you've complicated things considerably. So you'll leave? Camille was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying Eleanor with unsettling intensity. You know, Eleanor, there is another option we haven't discussed. Which is? You could have an accident, too. Old women fall downstairs all the time. Or perhaps a car accident on your way home from lunch. These country roads can be so dangerous, especially in winter weather. Eleanor's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to remain calm. If anything happens to me, the FBI gets everything automatically. I've made arrangements. I'm sure you have, but arrangements can be circumvented, and evidence can disappear. You'd be surprised how easily these things can be managed with the right connections.
You're insane, Eleanor whispered. I'm practical, Camille corrected, though I admit I'm starting to like this option better than my original plan. James will inherit everything much sooner this way, and with you out of the picture, there won't be anyone around to ask inconvenient questions. Eleanor's mind raced. She had walked into this confrontation thinking she held all the cards, but Camille had just shown her how wrong she was. The criminal network was more sophisticated and more ruthless than she had imagined. Of course, Camille said, settling back in her chair. There is still the option of you forgetting everything you think you know and allowing me to marry your son peacefully. I'd be willing to sign a prenuptial agreement limiting my access to the family assets. 40% seems fair. 40% of everything James owns? It's quite generous, considering the alternative is 100% after your unfortunate accident. Eleanor stared at this woman who looked like an angel and spoke like a demon. The casual way she discussed murder and theft was more chilling than any outright threat. I need to think about this, Eleanor said, finally. Of course. Take all the time you need, but not too much time. James and I are getting our marriage license tomorrow, and I'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen before then. Camille stood gracefully, smoothing her coat. Oh, and Eleanor, don't try to involve the authorities just yet. My associates are watching your house, your phone, your movements. Any sign that you're not keeping our conversation private, and we'll have to implement the alternative plan immediately. She leaned down, placing her hand gently on Eleanor's shoulder, in a gesture that would look affectionate to any observer. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. It would be a shame if it were your last. Then she was gone, walking through the country club dining room with the same elegant grace she'd shown at Eleanor's dinner table, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the lingering chill of death. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair for several minutes, processing what had just happened.
She had thought she was setting a trap for Camille, but instead she had walked directly into one herself. Worse, she had revealed the full extent of her knowledge, giving Camille the information she needed to plan Eleanor's elimination. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Everything okay in there? MW." Eleanor looked around the dining room, noting the other patrons enjoying their quiet lunches, oblivious to the fact that they had just witnessed someone calmly planning a murder. She typed back, "Fine, we'll call you later." But she knew nothing was fine. She was now trapped in a deadly game with professional killers, and she had less than 24 hours to find a way to save both herself and her son. As she walked to her car on unsteady legs, Eleanor realized that the real battle was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Mother's Gambit. Eleanor drove home in a daze, Camille's threats echoing in her mind. By the time she pulled into her driveway, however, the initial shock had given way to something else: cold, methodical fury. She had survived diplomatic crises, hostile foreign governments, and social scandals that would have broken lesser women. She had raised a son alone after Richard's death, built a life of dignity and purpose, and earned respect in circles where respect was not easily given. She would not be intimidated by a criminal, no matter how sophisticated or dangerous. Eleanor went directly to Richard's study and called Marcus Webb from the secure landline. "We have a problem," she said, without preamble, then described the entire confrontation at the country club. Webb was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "Mrs. Whitmore, you need to go into hiding immediately. If she's threatening to kill you, she's also threatening my son. If I disappear, she'll know I'm trying to expose her, and James could be in immediate danger. If you stay, you're definitely in danger." Eleanor had been thinking about this during the drive home. "Not necessarily. She needs me alive long enough to get married. After that, yes, I become expendable. But for the next 24 hours, I'm probably safer than I'll ever be again." 24 hours isn't much time to build a case that will stick. Then we don't build a case. We destroy her another way. She outlined her new plan to Webb, who listened with growing alarm. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're proposing is incredibly dangerous. If it goes wrong, if I do nothing, I'm dead anyway. At least this way I have a chance to save James." After hanging up with Webb, Eleanor sat in Richard's chair and tried to think like the criminals she was fighting. Camille's operation depended on secrecy and careful preparation. Everything was planned months in advance, with multiple contingencies and escape routes. But every plan had weaknesses, and Eleanor thought she had identified Camille's biggest vulnerability: her relationship with James. Camille needed James to trust her completely. Any doubt, any suspicion, any crack in their relationship would threaten the entire operation. And despite her criminal sophistication, Camille had made one crucial error. She had underestimated how well Eleanor knew her own son. Eleanor picked up her phone and called James. "James, darling, I need to speak with you urgently. Can you come over for dinner tonight? Just you. I'd like to have some private time with my son before the wedding planning gets too hectic." James sounded pleased. "Of course, Mom. Is everything all right? You sound a bit stressed." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just some things we need to discuss. Can you be here by 7? After confirming dinner plans, Eleanor made another call, this one to Dr. Patricia Henley, a psychiatrist who had been a close friend since their children had attended school together. "Patricia, I need a professional consultation about something very serious. Can you come over this evening? I'll explain everything when you arrive." Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for what might be the most important evening of her life. She cooked James's favorite meal, beef tenderloin with her special herb crust, roasted vegetables, and apple tart for dessert. She set the dining room table with the good china and silver, as if this were a celebration rather than a crisis. At 6:30, Dr. Henley arrived. Eleanor quickly explained the situation, showing her the evidence Webb had compiled and describing Camille's threats. "Eleanor, you need to contact the authorities immediately," Patricia said after reviewing the materials. "The authorities can't protect us from someone this sophisticated, but you can help me protect James." Eleanor explained what she needed Patricia to do. The psychiatrist looked deeply uncomfortable with the request. What you're asking, it's ethically questionable at best. Patricia, my son is about to marry a woman who has murdered people. Standard ethics don't apply here. At exactly 7 o'clock, James arrived with flowers for his mother and excitement about the wedding plans. Eleanor hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and trying to memorize the feeling of holding her child safe in her arms. Over dinner, they talked about normal things: his work, her volunteer activities, mutual friends. Eleanor studied her son's face, noting the happiness there, the glow of a man deeply in love. It broke her heart to know she was about to shatter that happiness. James, she said as they moved to the living room for coffee, I need to ask you some questions about Camille, and I need you to really think about your answers. James looked puzzled, but nodded. Of course. What do you want to know? How much do you actually know about her past? Her family, her education, her life in France? Mom, we've discussed this. I know she's private about some things because losing her parents was traumatic, but have you ever spoken to anyone who knew her before she came to America? Friends from France, former colleagues, anyone? James frowned. Well, no, but that's not unusual. When people immigrate, they often lose touch with. Have you seen her passport, birth certificate, any official documentation of her identity? Mom, what's this about? James's voice was becoming defensive. You're starting to sound like you're interrogating her. Eleanor took a deep breath. James, I'm going to show you some things, and I need you to look at them with an open mind. Can you do that for me? She spread out the documents Webb had compiled, the Interpol files, the newspaper articles, the financial records. James examined them with growing confusion and alarm. This can't be right. This woman, Camille Laurent, she looks like Camille, but it's the same person, James. Your fiancé is a wanted criminal. James stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. No, this is impossible. There has to be some explanation. Maybe they're sisters, or... James, Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. I know this is devastating, but you need to face the truth. The truth? James spun around, his face flushed with anger. The truth is that you've never liked Camille. You've been looking for reasons to break us up since the beginning. This was the reaction Eleanor had expected, but it still hurt. Sweetheart, I know you're in love with her, but I'm not just in love with her, Mom. I'm going to marry her. And if you can't accept that, then she's planning to kill me. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. James stared at his mother, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and confusion. That's insane. Camille would never... She's the gentlest person I know. Eleanor told him about the confrontation at the country club, repeating Camille's threats word for word. James listened with growing agitation, shaking his head repeatedly. You're misunderstanding something, or taking things out of context, or... He stopped, running his hands through his hair. Mom, I think you need help. Professional help. This was Eleanor's cue. You're right, James. I've been under tremendous stress lately, and maybe I'm not thinking clearly. That's why I asked Dr. Henley to join us tonight. Patricia entered from the kitchen where she had been waiting, and Eleanor introduced her as a family friend who happened to be a psychiatrist. James, your mother asked me to speak with both of you because she's concerned about some episodes she's been having lately. Paranoid thoughts, conspiracy theories, difficulty distinguishing reality from imagination. Eleanor had to admire Patricia's performance. Her friend was playing the role perfectly, despite her obvious uncomfort with the deception. Episodes? James looked between his mother and the psychiatrist with growing alarm. It's not uncommon in people your mother's age, especially after experiencing significant stress or loss. The mind sometimes creates elaborate scenarios to explain feelings of anxiety or displacement. Eleanor forced herself to look confused and slightly frightened. I was so certain. The evidence seemed so... Evidence can be misinterpreted when we're not thinking clearly. Eleanor, why don't you tell James about some of the other concerns you've been having lately? Eleanor played her part perfectly, describing imaginary symptoms, difficulty sleeping, confusion about dates and events. paranoid thoughts about neighbors and friends. James listened with growing concern and guilt. "Mom, why didn't you tell me you were struggling like this? I didn't want to worry you, especially with the wedding coming up. I suppose I've been feeling replaced, like I'm losing my son to another woman." "Oh, Mom." He pulled her into a hug. "You're not losing me. Camille and I both want you to be a huge part of our lives." As they embraced, Eleanor caught Patricia's eye over James's shoulder. The psychiatrist nodded slightly. The performance was working. "I think I should probably talk to Camille," Eleanor continued, her voice shaky. "Apologize for any strange behavior lately. I'm sure I've been acting oddly without realizing it." "That's a wonderful idea," James said. "She's been worried about you, actually. She mentioned that you seemed tense at lunch the other day." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Camille had mentioned their lunch to James, which meant she was already managing the narrative, controlling how he interpreted Eleanor's behavior. "Dr. Henley," James said, turning to Patricia, "what kind of treatment would my mother need? Is this something serious? With proper treatment and family support, most people recover completely from these kinds of episodes. The key is recognizing the problem and getting help quickly." After Patricia left and James had gone home, promising to bring Camille by the next evening so Eleanor could apologize, Eleanor sat alone in her living room and contemplated what she had just done. She had convinced her son that she was mentally ill. She had enlisted a friend in an elaborate deception. She had bought herself perhaps one more day before Camille decided she was too dangerous to live. But she had also planted seeds of doubt in James's mind. The loving concern in his eyes had been mixed with something else, a watchfulness, a new awareness that something wasn't quite right in his world. Eleanor's phone rang at 11 p.m. Camille's voice was silk over steel. "Eleanor, James told me about your episode tonight. How concerning."
Yes, I'm quite embarrassed about the whole thing. Dr. Henley thinks I may have been having some kind of breakdown. How fortunate that you're getting help. James was so relieved to have an explanation for your recent behavior. Eleanor could hear the satisfaction in Camille's voice. The criminal thought she had won, that Eleanor's credibility was now completely destroyed. "I hope you'll forgive me for any strange accusations I may have made," Eleanor said humbly. "I clearly wasn't thinking straight." "Of course, Eleanor. Family is so important. I'm just grateful James has someone like you in his life." The conversation ended with arrangements for Eleanor to come to dinner at James's apartment the following evening, where she would formally apologize to Camille, and they could start fresh as a family. Eleanor hung up and walked to Richard's study, where she pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. If her plan failed, if Camille succeeded in killing her, she wanted to leave behind a complete record of everything she had discovered. But more than that, she was planning her final gambit, one last desperate attempt to save her son before it was too late. She wrote for 3 hours, documenting every detail of Camille's criminal network, every piece of evidence Webb had uncovered, every threat that had been made. When she finished, she sealed the document in an envelope and addressed it to the FBI field office in New York. Then she wrote a second letter, this one to James, telling him the truth about everything she had done and why. This letter she sealed and placed in her safe, along with copies of all the evidence. Finally, she wrote a third letter, the most important one of all. This one was addressed to Camille Dubois, and it contained an offer that might save them all or get Eleanor killed immediately. As dawn broke over the Connecticut countryside, Eleanor sealed the final envelope and prepared for what might be the last day of her life. Chapter 8. The Final Gambit. Eleanor spent the morning making arrangements that felt disturbingly like preparing for her own funeral. She updated her will, left detailed instructions for her housekeeper, and placed the letters she had written in locations where they would be found if she disappeared. At noon, she drove to a FedEx office and mailed the package to the FBI with instructions that it be opened if she failed to call by a specific time the following day. Then she returned home and waited.
The call came at 2 p.m. Eleanor, I hope you're feeling better today. Dr. Henley's prescribed is helping tremendously. Much better, thank you. James and I are so looking forward to dinner tonight. Shall we say 7 o'clock? Actually, Camille, I was wondering if we could meet a bit earlier, just the two of us, before James gets home from work. I have something I'd like to give you privately, a family heirloom that I'd like you to have as a wedding gift. There was a pause. Eleanor could almost hear Camille calculating the risks and benefits of a private meeting. How thoughtful. What did you have in mind? Could we come by around 5? We could have tea and talk, woman to woman. I think it would help clear the air between us. That sounds lovely, Eleanor. I'll see you at 5. Eleanor hung up and immediately called Marcus Webb. It's happening today. Are you ready? Mrs. Whitmore, I still think this is insane. Let me call the FBI right now. We can… Marcus, we've been through this. They need evidence of an actual crime in progress, not just threats and financial irregularities. Tonight, we get that evidence. After confirming the technical arrangements with Webb, Eleanor spent the afternoon preparing her house like a stage set. Hidden recording devices were positioned throughout the living room and study. Webb would be monitoring from a van parked 3 blocks away, ready to intervene if things went wrong. At 4:45, Eleanor took a long shower and dressed carefully in a navy silk dress. Elegant enough for dignity, practical enough for whatever might happen. She clasped her grandmother's pearl necklace around her throat, thinking it was fitting to wear a family heirloom if this turned out to be her last day alive. At exactly 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Camille stood on the doorstep, looking radiant in a cream-colored coat, her blonde hair gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight. She could have been a magazine model or a young socialite coming for tea with a friend's mother. Eleanor, you look wonderful, much more rested than I saw you last. Thank you, dear. Please, come in. They settled in the living room with the same ritual of tea and small talk that had marked their previous encounters. But this time, Eleanor could see the predatory calculation behind her perfect smile. I brought you something, Eleanor said, reaching for a small wrapped package on the side table. It's a brooch that belonged to my mother-in-law. She would have wanted James's wife to have it. Camille unwrapped the package with practiced grace, revealing an Art Deco sapphire brooch surrounded by diamonds. It was worth at least $20,000, and Camille's eyes gleamed as she examined it. Eleanor, this is absolutely gorgeous. But are you sure? It seems like such a valuable family piece. I'm sure. Consider it an apology for my behavior lately, and a welcome to the family. Camille pinned the brooch to her coat with evident satisfaction. Thank you so much. I'll treasure it always. I'm sure you will. At least, until you fence it for cash. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Camille's smile froze, then slowly faded as she processed what Eleanor had just said. I'm sorry, I don't understand. You course you do, Camille. Or should I call you by one of your other names? I know there are several. Camille set down her teacup with deliberate precision. Eleanor, I think your medication may be affecting your judgment again. My judgment is perfectly clear, and I know exactly who and what you are. The transformation was instantaneous. The sweet, vulnerable young woman disappeared, replaced by something cold and dangerous. Camille's posture straightened, her expression hardened, and her voice dropped to a register Eleanor had never heard before. Well, well, the senile old woman isn't quite as senile as she pretended. Not senile at all. Just a mother protecting her child. Camille stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds with the casual confidence of someone surveying property she already owned.
You've been busy since our last conversation, she said. I assume yesterday's performance with the psychiatrist was designed to make James doubt anything you might tell him about me? Among other things. Clever. Not clever enough, but better than I expected from someone your age. Camille turned back to face Eleanor. But ultimately pointless. James loves me. Even if you manage to convince him you're not mentally ill, he wouldn't believe you about me. Love makes people remarkably stupid. Eleanor stood as well, moving to position herself between Camille and the door. You're right about love making people stupid, but you made one critical error in your assessment. Which was? You assumed that James's love for you was stronger than his love for me. Camille laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Eleanor, you're his mother. Of course he loves you. But I'm going to be his wife, the mother of his children, his partner for the rest of his life. Maternal love is touching, but it can't compete with that. Can't it? Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a recording transmitter that would broadcast everything being said to Webb's monitoring station. James, darling, are you listening? Camille spun toward the door, and Eleanor saw the exact moment when she realized she had been trapped. Standing in the doorway was James, his face pale with shock and confusion. What's going on here? He demanded, looking between his mother and his fiancée. James, Camille said, her mask slipping back into place with desperate speed. Your mother asked me to come early so she could, well, I think she's having another episode. But Eleanor could see that something had changed in James's expression. The conversation he had just overheard, Camille's casual dismissal of maternal love, her cold calculation about his emotions, had planted seeds of doubt that would be difficult to ignore. Another episode? James said slowly. Camille, what did you mean when you said love makes people stupid? I was trying to humor her delusions, darling. She was saying strange things about me having other names, and I thought if I played along. And what did you mean about fencing the brooch for cash? Camille's eyes darted between Eleanor and James, calculating rapidly. James, you have to understand, your mother has been making accusations, threatening me, threatening you. How? Eleanor stepped forward. James, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Your life may depend on it. Over the next 20 minutes, Eleanor laid out everything. The overheard phone conversation, the investigation, the evidence of Camille's criminal past, the threats against Eleanor's life. James listened in stunned silence, while Camille alternated between denials, explanations, and increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. She's sick, James, she pleaded. Can't you see that? She's creating elaborate fantasies. Then explain the brooch comment? Explain knowing about fencing stolen goods? Explain talking about my love for you like it was a business calculation. I was trying to speak her language to calm her down. Show him your passport. Show him any documentation that proves you're really Camille Dubois from Lyon, France. I don't have to prove anything to... She stopped, realizing how guilty her refusal sounded. James looked at his fiancée with new eyes, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the calculation behind the beauty, the performance behind the passion. Camille, are you really who you say you are? For a long moment, the three of them stood frozen in tableau. The mother who had risked everything to save her son, the criminal who had been exposed at the moment of her greatest triumph, and the man caught between love and truth. Then Camille made her final play. James, I love you, she said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. Whatever your mother thinks she has discovered, whatever lies she's been told, the one truth that matters is that I love you with all my heart. Eleanor watched her son's face and saw him wavering. Even with everything he had heard, even with the evidence before him, he wanted to believe in the woman he loved. And that's when Eleanor played her last card. Marcus, she said into the transmitter, bring in the backup recording. James looked confused, but Camille went rigid with fear. What backup recording? Eleanor smiled sadly at her son. The recording of your fiancé planning my murder. Chapter 9. Truth and Consequences. The next few minutes passed in a blur of accusations, denials, and revelations that shattered James's world completely.
Marcus Webb arrived with 2 FBI agents and a portable recording device containing the conversation from the country club, where Camille had calmly discussed killing Eleanor and making James's grief work to her advantage. James listened to his fiancée's voice, describing his mother as an old cow, and plotting Eleanor's death with the same tone she might use to discuss dinner plans. Eleanor watched her son's face transform from confusion to horror, to a grief so profound it was painful to witness. "Is that really your voice?" James asked Camille, though they all knew the answer. Camille had stopped protesting. The mask had finally fallen away completely, revealing someone Eleanor barely recognized. Cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. "Yes," she said simply. "It's my voice. And you were really planning to kill my mother, if necessary?" Camille's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were confirming the weather forecast. James staggered backward, reaching for a chair to support himself. "Who are you? Who are you really? Does it matter now? Your mother has destroyed everything anyway." "I destroyed nothing. I protected my son from a murderer." "You protected him from happiness," Camille snapped, showing real emotion for the first time. "I would have made him happy. For years, maybe decades, he would have lived a wonderful life with me. Till you killed him for his inheritance. That wasn't the plan. The plan was for him to die naturally in old age, after a long and fulfilling marriage."
The casual way she discussed planning James's eventual death, even if decades in the future, left everyone in the room speechless. One of the FBI agents stepped forward. "Camille Laurent, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and violations of federal immigration law." As they handcuffed her, Camille looked directly at James. "I did love you, you know, as much as I'm capable of loving anyone." That wasn't entirely a lie. "How much of it was real?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The sex was real. The conversations were pleasant enough. I enjoyed the restaurants you took me to." Camille considered the questions seriously. "But love? I'm not sure I know what that means anymore." They led her away, and Eleanor was left alone with her son in the living room, where this nightmare had begun weeks earlier with a seemingly perfect dinner and a beautiful engagement ring. James sat in stunned silence for a long time, the family ring still clutched in his hand. He had removed it from Camille's finger just before the FBI took her away, a gesture that seemed to symbolize the end of more than just an engagement. "How did you know?" he asked. Eleanor sat beside him on the couch and took his hand. "I heard her talking on the phone that first night she came to dinner. She called me an old cow and talked about the inheritance and the green card. And you investigated her for weeks without telling me? Would you have believed me if I had?" James was quiet for a moment. "No, probably not. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorry you had to go through this. Sorry your heart is broken. Sorry I couldn't find a way to protect you without deceiving you. You saved my life, Mom. She was going to kill me eventually, wasn't she?" Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I don't know. Maybe not for years. But yes, I think eventually she would have found a way to make you disappear when it became financially advantageous." They sat together in the gathering darkness, mother and son processing the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Eleanor thought about all the ways this could have gone wrong. If James hadn't listened to the recording, if Camille had been more careful, if the criminal network had been more sophisticated in their surveillance. "What happens now?" James asked. "Now you heal. You grieve for the woman you thought you loved, and you learn to trust again. It will take time." "I feel so stupid. How could I not have seen it?" "Because she was very good at what she did, and because you loved her. Love doesn't make us stupid, James, despite what she said. Love makes us vulnerable, which is different." Over the following weeks, the true scope of Camille's criminal enterprise was revealed. The FBI investigation uncovered a network spanning multiple countries, with victims in the millions of dollars and at least 5 suspicious deaths linked to the organization. Camille, whose real name turned out to be Michelle Dubois,
though she had used dozens of aliases over the years, cooperated with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. She provided information that led to the arrest of Michel Rousseau, Sophie Moreau, and the mysterious Le Docteur, who turned out to be a former psychology professor who had designed the psychological manipulation techniques the network used on their victims.
James struggled with depression and trust issues for months, but gradually began to heal with the help of therapy and his mother's unwavering support. The experience had changed him, making him more cautious, but also, Eleanor thought, more compassionate toward others who had been deceived or betrayed. Eleanor herself was hailed in the press as a hero, the mother who had saved her son from a deadly con artist through courage and determination. But she knew the truth was more complicated. She had been lucky as much as brave, and there had been moments when her plan could have gotten both of them killed. 6 months after Camille's arrest, Eleanor was working in her garden when James arrived for their weekly Sunday dinner. He looked healthier than he had in months, the haunted expression finally fading from his eyes. "Any word on the trial?" Eleanor asked as they walked inside together. "Her lawyer is trying to negotiate another plea deal. Apparently she has information about criminal networks in Europe that the authorities want." Eleanor nodded. She had mixed feelings about Camille potentially receiving a reduced sentence, but she understood the practical realities of prosecuting international crime. "How are you doing with all of this?" she asked her son. James was quiet for a moment. "Better. I'm seeing someone, actually. Dr. Henley recommended a therapist who specializes in recovery from abusive relationships." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. And I'm thinking about dating again. Not seriously, just testing the waters." Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of maternal concern, followed immediately by a surge of pride. James was healing, moving forward, learning to trust his instincts again. "Just promise me one thing," she said as they settled in the living room with pre-dinner drinks. "What's that?" "Next time you get serious about someone, let me do a background check first." James laughed, the first genuine laugh Eleanor had heard from him in months. "Deal, though I'm hoping my judgment has improved." "Your judgment was never the problem, darling. Your heart was too open, too trusting. Don't let this experience close it completely." As they talked and laughed over dinner, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. She had always known she would do anything to protect her son, but she had never imagined that anything would include becoming an amateur detective, confronting dangerous criminals, and orchestrating elaborate deceptions. But she regretted none of it. A mother's love was indeed a powerful force, capable of inspiring courage, cunning, and determination in the face of impossible odds. James was safe. He was healing. He would love again, more wisely perhaps, but no less deeply. And Eleanor Whitmore had learned that even at 62, she was far more capable of courage and cunning than she had ever imagined. Sometimes, she reflected as she watched her son laugh at one of his own jokes, a mother's intuition was the most powerful weapon of all. Epilogue. 3 years later. Eleanor stood at the altar of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, watching her son marry Sarah Chen, a pediatric surgeon he had met at a medical conference. Sarah was intelligent, kind, and refreshingly straightforward, qualities that James now valued above all others. The wedding was small and intimate, attended by close friends and family. Eleanor had indeed run a background check on Sarah, though she had done so discreetly and with Sarah's amused consent. The investigation had revealed exactly what Eleanor expected: a brilliant woman with a genuine heart and no hidden agendas. As James and Sarah exchanged vows, Eleanor thought about the twisting path that had brought them to this moment. The investigation into Camille's network had led to dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions in stolen assets. Camille herself was serving a 15-year sentence in federal prison, her cooperation with the authorities having earned her a reduction from what could have been a life sentence. Eleanor had received letters from some of the other victims, families whose lives had been destroyed by the criminal network. Their gratitude was overwhelming, but Eleanor knew she hadn't been fighting for them. She had been fighting for her son, driven by the ancient, primal imperative of a mother protecting her child. After the ceremony, as the small reception got underway in the church's fellowship hall, Sarah approached Eleanor with a glass of champagne, Thank you, Sarah said simply. For what, dear? For raising a man worth marrying, and for making sure he survived long enough for me to find him. Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the roads that had led to this moment, the dangers faced, the lies told, the courage summoned from depths she hadn't known she possessed. It was my pleasure, she said. After all, that's what mothers do. As she watched James dancing with his new wife, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The nightmare was over. Her son was safe, happy, and loved by someone worthy of him. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had once thought her most dangerous days were behind her, had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we think our stories are nearly over. The mother's intuition had been right all along, and sometimes being right was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price at all.